So it's 7.
There we go. Give people a moment to log on. Welcome, everyone. All right. Welcome to today's WNBA Author Talk. My name is Julie Fry, and I am a member of the Women's National Book Association's Greater Philadelphia chapter, and I serve as the Women's Communication and the WNBA's Communications and Events Chair. We are excited today to welcome WNBA New York City members Doris Weatherford and Valerie Tomaselli to today's Author Talk in celebration of Women's History Month. Hi.
Hi.
Award-winning author and historian Doris Weatherford has been publishing books on women's history for over 30 years. Her most recent book is Victory for the Vote, which was published by Mango Publishing in 2020, just in time for the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Victory for the Vote puts the fight for suffrage into contemporary context by highlighting the revolutionary women whose activism changed our world in the decades following the passage of the suffrage amendment. Doris' list of awards include the League of Women Voters Lifetime Achievement Award and the American Library Association's 2013 Award for Outstanding Reference Source. She has served in many board positions, including being a member of the Board of Trustees for the National Women's History Museum in Washington, D.C., where she also served as Vice President for Programs, and as a member of the Executive Board of the Women's National History Project, now Alliance, which founded Women's History Month. Our moderator tonight is Valerie Tomaselli. Valerie is the head of MTN Publishing, which has produced a long list of acclaimed books for clients such as DK Publishing, CQ Press, Greenwood, Oxford University Press, Macmillan, Routledge, Sage Publications, and Scribner's, along with a host of private clients. She has worked with Doris Weatherford on many of her women's history books and is currently helping the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum develop their publishing program. Yay. She is a longtime member of the Women's National Book Association and the American Book Producers Association, serving on the board of directors for both organizations. Both Doris and Valerie were part of the wonderful team responsible for our centennial publication, Women in the Literary Landscape. A quick note, please write any questions you have in the Q&A or chat. I'll be checking them throughout the talk, and there will be time toward the end of the event where we will ask Doris and Valerie questions. Without further ado, I give you Doris and Valerie.
Thank you, Julie. Hello, everyone. Hi, Doris. Great to see you for this conversation. I'm so glad all of you could come. As Julie mentioned in the introduction, Doris and I have been working together for a long time on, I don't know, 6, 7,
1998.
1998, which is a good segue, actually, right? 1998, the first edition of this book was published as a history of the American suffragist movement. And then as 2020 came along, we thought that we should obviously, for obvious reasons, do a new edition and update it with what happened since the 1920 ratification of the amendment, of the 19th Amendment. We thought we would start with start at the end. Doris is going to read from the last, close to the last pages of the book. And it's kind of evidence of what a struggle the fight for suffrage was. And it has echoes in how much struggle and controversy and conflict can surround this kind of fight for change. You may find echoes of it in the fight over the 2020 election. So, Doris.
Yeah, so often women's rights are treated as though they just fell from the sky. This was a very difficult, sophisticated campaign that ran from 1848, when we had the first call for the right to vote at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, on through Congress, and as Valerie said, we're going to start at the end. The Constitution requires amendments to be passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. So at this point in August of 1920, we had the 2/3 of Congress. We almost had the 3/4 of the states. We had just finished a wild campaign in West Virginia, which is equally bizarre as what I'm going to read you. But this is the final one in Nashville, Tennessee. On August 18th, the Tennessee House voted. As in Congress earlier, some supporters made superhuman efforts for women. Banks S. Turner literally threw off the speaker's arm from around his shoulder, perhaps casting away his career as he cast his affirmative vote. R.L. Dolan came from a hospital bed, and T.A. Dodson came back from a train that was leaving the station to vote, even though his baby was dying. The tally was 48-48, a defeat for women, when conscience struck 24-year-old Harry Burns. He remembered his mother's letter asking him to help Mrs. Catt with the rat and ratification, and his promise to her that in case of a tie, he would vote for suffrage. After Burns switched his vote to the affirmative, anti-suffragists charged that he had been bribed. He demanded a point of personal privilege to record in the Legislative Journal the statement, quote, "I changed my vote in favor of ratification because I believe in full suffrage as a right. I believe we had a moral and legal right to ratify. I know that my mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." He did so. And by 49-47, American women gained their freedom. And yet, the game was not over. Speaker Walker switched his vote and moved to reconsider. House rules gave the Speaker 3 days during which only he could call up a move to reconsider, and opponents used that time in a frantic attempt to get one of the 49 to switch. When they did not seem to be accomplishing that, they reached into their bag of tricks for one more astonishment. At the urging of their lobbyist friends, legislators who had failed to win democratically hid themselves. Slipping out of Nashville in the dark of night, they holed up in Decatur, Alabama for more than a week. They hoped to prevent a quorum. Amazingly, the 49 stayed loyal. Governor Roberts, whose support had been uncertain only weeks earlier, had seen the depths to which opponents of female freedom were willing to sink, and he took the certificate of ratification and mailed it off to Washington. At noon on August 26, when Secretary of State Bainbridge Cooley received it, he declared the 19th Amendment added to the Constitution. Women's longest labor was over. Carrie Chapman Catt summed it up. Since the 1848 Seneca Falls call for the right to vote, she counted 480 campaigns in state legislatures, 56 statewide referenda to male voters, 47 attempts to add suffrage blanks during the revisions of state constitutions, 277 campaigns at state party conventions, and 30 at national conventions, and 19 biennial campaigns in 19 different Congresses. Literally thousands of times, men cast their votes on whether or not women could vote. Literally millions of women and men gave their entire lives to the cause and went to their graves with freedom unwon. No peaceful political change ever has required so much from so many for so long.
There you go. It was a long, long, hard fight. And maybe it's a good time, Doris, to talk about some of the complexities along the way. Maybe specifically at the state level, I think a lot of people don't realize that it wasn't a straightforward march.
Yeah. One of the things I try to stress, and that people are only beginning to understand, is that all of feminism has been a conflict between, quote, state rights and women's rights. States made laws on marriage, states made laws on education, states made laws on who could vote. Men never would put up with that crap. But where you lived mattered a great, great deal for women, and still does in terms of abortion rights. Still
Right.
does.
Yeah.
But going back, the first entity that granted women the right to vote was the Wyoming Territory in 1869. They did it because they wanted women to move there. There were 50 men for every woman. They thought it'd be attractive to women, and it was. And they came, and some women did some good things in Wyoming. It's hard to accept now, but the West was much more liberal then than the East. And by the time that the first Eastern state, New York, ratified in 1917, every Western state except New Mexico had granted women full voting rights.
Yeah, that's an amazing, amazing thing, especially the way we think about contemporary America. It's first, the story of Utah is an interesting story, isn't it, Doris?
Okay, all right. Just 6 weeks after Wyoming granted the vote, the Utah Territory granted the vote. And that became a real problem for the original women back east, the Susan B. Anthony's, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's, and so forth, because people said, quite reasonably, that Utah was doing this because it was a Mormon entity, and men would control women's votes, and so
Right.
it got tied up with sex, polygamy. The whole issue was always tied up with alcohol, because that's why the lobbyists in Nashville campaigned so hard against it, because there was an assumption that if women had the vote, they would vote,
Right.
vote in prohibition,
Right.
which wasn't true. But anyway, Utah women won the vote and then lost it when Utah became a state. Congress insisted that they drop it, and it wasn't until quite a while later that they got it back. But the first female state senator was from Utah and was the fourth wife of a Mormon elder. So there is so much to learn here, so much that hasn't been taught.
Yeah. Are there any other surprising stories about territories or states that are of interest?
Immediately after Utah, Washington State granted the vote.
Ah.
And its Supreme Court turned it over on a technicality. And it took them decades to get it back. I think it was 1887 that they lost it, in 1910 before they got it back. Oregon ran 6 campaigns before they finally got the vote. 6 campaigns. So this took tremendous dedication from women, and tremendous political skill that still isn't recognized.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that skill? I mean, what were some of their strategies and tactics?
Well, this whole thing comes down to a larger issue too. Is cooperation or competition the better strategy? In the 19th century, there was a big fight between the advocates of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the supporters of Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, even Louise May Alcott. It was basically, I'm sorry, a New York Boston fight. And they lost a lot of time on that.
Right.
And other scandals came into it. Henry Ward Beecher, who had at one time been the president of the American.
Whoops. Is Julie, I don't know if you can hear me, but it looks like Doris has.
It looks like she's frozen. So let's see if she'll come back.
American woman.
There she is. Okay.
All right. Okay. Where did you lose me?
Yeah, you were talking
Anyway.
about, we heard it was a New York,
All
Boston.
right, New York, Boston struggle. So that was immediately after the Civil War, immediately in the 1860s. And the prime fight was about whether or not the 14th Amendment applied to women.
Right.
The 14th Amendment granted civil rights to former slaves. And it did say male, but the 15th Amendment that assured the right to vote to former slaves did not say anything about male. It just said citizens. So a St. Louis woman took this all the way to the Supreme Court. The court just unanimously laughed at her, quoted the Bible more than the Constitution, said clearly the 15th Amendment didn't intend to grant women the right to vote. So the only thing to do then was to add the amendment by adding the amendment.
Yeah.
And back to the conflict, by the end of the century, these women were aging, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter and Lucy Stone's daughter brought them back into one big organization. But then there was still quite a few years of stalemate because they didn't have a really astute leader until Carrie Chapman Catt came along. And we had competition again towards the end when Alice Paul and her more radical people thought that Catt was too slow. Ultimately, I think you need both. You need the crazies out there in the street, and you need the women who can put on their pearls and go talk to Congress.
That's again another lesson for today, perhaps. You touched on this a little bit, well, not quite, but the mainstream, let's call it, suffrage movement, it's now even more and more apparent than it was 30, 40 years ago, marginalized women of color. You have done a lot of research and you tried to bring some of their stories into the book. It's not necessarily an easy corrective to make to history, but can you talk about some of those women and that issue in general?
Sure. On the one hand, they were always there. Sojourner Truth attended the third meeting, the third national meeting, before Susan Anthony did. Susan Anthony didn't do it until the fourth. And there was something of a fight about whether or not Sojourner Truth was going to be allowed to speak, but the woman who presided over it insisted that she be allowed to speak, and her speech was excellent. It's the famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. And she continued to come to meetings. There were always upper class Black women on the edges. Josephine St. Pierre in Boston, and Anna Julia Cooper in Washington, D.C. When women tested the 14th Amendment by going out and voting to get the case to Congress, testing the 15th Amendment, there were 24 jurisdictions across the nation where women voted so that they could be arrested, so that they could take this case to court. And there were Black women in South Carolina who did that. So there were always women on the fringes, and yet there was always concern because the antis very blatantly said, this is going to allow Black women to, I mean, they were awful about it, about spelling out how dangerous it was. Not just Black women, but also Catholic women. Oliver Wendell Holmes is seen as a liberal, and yet he opposed the vote because he said, quote, Hannah has enough power at the breakfast table, referring to Irish servants.
Wow.
So class, very much, class and race very much affect any cause. And I would not call any of the suffragists, any of the leaders racist, but in terms of political strategy, they didn't necessarily encourage a real presence because they knew that that would be a political negative.
I find it interesting, you've discussed this already, but the factionalism, which we find present throughout any kind of serious political movement, social movement, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about Alice Paul and the, is it the women's, what is it? The women's political movement? No,
Yeah, National Women's Party.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did kind of skip over her when Alice Paul and her friends, Lucy Burns, others, had been educated in Britain. And so they were very much influenced by the British movement, which was shorter than ours, but much more violent, much more visible.
Aggressive. Yeah.
And so British women got to vote before we did because they misbehaved. They set fire to mailboxes. They demonstrated in front of the homes of members of parliament. They got themselves arrested. And Alice Paul brought that strategy here and formed. First, she tried to work with the mainstream movement, but most of the mainstream women wouldn't accept it. So she and her younger women split off and formed their own National Women's Party. So they picketed, they deliberately got themselves arrested. And most of all, in 1913, when Woodrow Wilson was about to be inaugurated as president, they paraded in Washington, D.C. Now, this was not the first parade, but it was the first one in Washington. And cops didn't know how to handle it. So they attacked these women very violently. And the public was sympathetic to the women. So they decided to try more of these strategies of getting themselves arrested. They chained themselves to the White House fence and allowed themselves to be force-fed in their prison down in Virginia. And again, I think both. Their tactics, I regret that they continued that anti-Wilson approach, even after Wilson had endorsed the suffrage amendment. I didn't say it when we were talking about Tennessee, but the Tennessee vote probably would not have happened without President Wilson's intervention as a Democrat, talking to other Democrats in Tennessee. As a Southern Democrat, he was from Virginia. And so one of Wilson's daughter was a leader in the mainstream movement, but the National Women's Party continued to picket the White House in a way that didn't acknowledge that Wilson was supporting the amendment. And that caused a lot of animosity with the mainstream movement. Some of them, Mrs. Williams Jennings Bryan, who was the most active person here in Florida, they had retired to Florida. She thought that the Women's Party was an agent of the Republican Party, just trying to cause dissension and cause trouble. So everything is complicated, just like today. You've got to look between the headlines.
Right. And my memory, Doris, is that the suffragists strongly supported, except for some exceptions, the U.S. as we entered World War I. Is that right?
The mainstream group did. The mainstream group, and Carrie Chapman Catt really believed that and she was right, that the fact that the amendment finally passed was due to women's work in World War I and to the publicity that they gave themselves for that. The Women's Party was made up of pacifists, and They objected to the war, of course. So this was another point of contention. And you do have to remember that in terms of security, chaining yourself to the White House fence during wartime and opposing the president who's living in the White House,
is dangerous.
yeah, you're asking to be arrested. And they didn't want to be arrested. They
Yes.
wanted the attention.
Yeah, yes. I wanted to draw attention to, well, I don't want to be a bummer about this, but I wanted to draw attention to the fact that the original book, published in 1998, in honor of the 150th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention, had a foreword by Geraldine Ferraro. Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to be on a major party presidential ticket. And of course, the current book features a foreword by Nancy Pelosi, arguably one of the most powerful women in politically in the history of the country. And then now, since 2021 inauguration, we have been celebrating the fact that we have the first woman vice president, and a Black woman at that. But my question is, it is taking a long time.
It is. It is.
Why?
Let me
This is
first
about the United States.
let me first celebrate the good
Yes.
thing that very, very few pundits noticed. When Biden gave his State of the Union speech a couple weeks ago, for the first time ever, the two people sitting behind him were women.
Yeah, that was
Kamala
powerful.
Harris and Nancy Pelosi, who will
Yeah.
be second and third in line to replace him if he
Yeah.
dies.
Yeah.
I mean, this is major, and nobody noticed it.
Yeah.
I didn't see one pundit write about it.
Yeah.
So that's one of our problems, that the pundits just ask the same questions. They go around doing anyway. But yes, it is taking a very long time. I used to say to my students that it's a mountain chain, peaks and valleys, and we're going through a valley right now. But I think we've been going through a valley for a very long time. Frankly, ever since the 1970s, when I was young and active, and we achieved a great deal. I do want to add, though, that things were achieved in that first half century that get no recognition. Part of the reason, the main reason, why Alice Paul filed the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, and next year will be the centennial of its filing. The main reason she filed it was that the 19th Amendment only granted the vote. It didn't speak other civil rights. So states were still prohibiting women from serving on juries. States were still making laws that discriminated against women in other ways. One of the most shocking things was the age of consent, which the General Federation of Women's Clubs worked on for years and years and years to get states to raise that. At the beginning of the 20th century, the age of consent in Delaware was 7 years old. Age of consent means the age at which a man can argue in court that a woman consented to sex and therefore he's not guilty of rape.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So we have made progress on that front. Until the 1960s, jury duty wasn't equal. 3 states banned women from juries completely. In other states, you had to actively go down and volunteer to get on a jury.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they did with this was because they didn't want women hearing rape cases.
Huh. This, by the way, I'll tell everyone, is something that is covered in the second part of the book that was added as a feature, so to speak, in the new edition. Several chapters update the progress that women have made. And there's 3 or 4 issue areas or topics that are the focus, and then a couple chapters on milestones that women have achieved. So talk a little more about the age of the ERA. You have maybe a slightly different take than other commentators on this.
Yeah. The story of my life. First, it's important to remember that when Alice Paul filed it, a lot of progressive women opposed it, including Eleanor Roosevelt. They had spent their lives getting protective labor legislation for women, doing other things for women that were explicitly for women. So all of these things would be nullified if you had equality.
Right. Yeah.
So the reasoning then was protect women. Don't make us equal because we still need protection. And then as things changed, as women were able to serve on juries, as the age of consent laws changed, as minimum wages, state minimum wage laws, until we got a federal minimum wage law, state laws discriminated with different wages for men and women. It wasn't until the 1950s that teacher pay became equal. Women always made much less than men in teaching. And again, it varied by state. So the thing to remember is states' rights versus women's rights. And the Equal Rights Amendment would have changed all these things. And it came very close to passage in just after World War II. In the 1970s, it came very close to passage. It did go through both houses of Congress, went to the states for ratification. And my state, Florida, was the last one to vote before the time extension ran out. And our Senate voted it down 21 to 19. So I take this very personally. At the same time, a half a century has passed, or almost a half a century. And the inequities that it would have addressed have largely disappeared. So I'm not sure that it's our best place for our time and money right now. Its passage really would not affect the issue of abortion rights because men don't get pregnant. You know, you can't say that this is an unequal law because it's biology. So I would rather see us concentrate on reproductive rights. And if they want to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, fine. It wouldn't do any harm, but it is a cosmic waste of energy at this point when we could be doing other things.
And in order for the passage to happen, the Congress needs to make a vote on another extension because by I don't know if it's by the Constitution.
Yeah.
Is it by the Constitution that the ratification has to happen during a certain?
The House has done that pro forma, but what are the chances with Mitch McConnell?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing to do is get active in campaigns. We find out who your legislators are and what their position is and get active in those campaigns.
Right.
It's never going to happen without starting completely over, and that's not going to happen. Even Nancy Pelosi doesn't make it a priority.
Interesting. This kind of leads into one of the last things I wanted to talk about, which is what about lessons for today? And it's so easy for those of us who are think about politics, and for politics is important to us. It's so easy to get discouraged and under the premise that all politics is local, a simplification, but
True.
how do you make change today? And taking lessons from the suffrage movement.
Yeah. I am pleased by most of the young women today. on the one hand, we are electing a bunch of anti-feminist women, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world and so forth. So I don't want people to vote for women because they are women. I do want people. I'm sorry. The association I'm speaking to does not take political stances,
That's
but just vote Democratic. This is a major difference between the two-party platforms. All you have to do is vote Democratic. I'm sorry. That's a little too blunt, and I wouldn't say it to every audience, but look at the platforms of the two parties and vote for the one that you agree with. We still have political platforms. So when the convention, well, there won't be one this year because it's midterm, but just vote for the Democrats in your midterm elections. I'm sorry. It's the only sensible thing.
Yeah, I think Doris was right when she says that we don't take political stances at the WNBA, but maybe I can put a slightly finer point on that, which is that Doris says vote for the Democrats, perhaps maybe vote for the party that has women's interests
There you go.
most at heart.
Mhm.
And we can let you draw your own
Yeah.
conclusions.
And you can go back and read the platform from last time. You know,
Yeah.
I don't think Trump even had a platform.
Yeah.
That there were no national conventions last time because of COVID.
Yeah.
But go back and read the previous platforms and you'll see a difference between the parties.
Yeah. The idea of making change being complex, and the idea that, and the fact that it can be a long, hard slog is something certainly that the suffrage movement shows us. Although certainly some change can happen quickly, depending on what, the women lost, women suddenly, because of World War II, gained a lot of employment rights, or maybe that's the wrong word, but circumstances can make change happen more quickly.
Yes.
But I just think that the message of the suffrage movement and what, and everyone, all of the activism that has happened since then, is that it takes dedication, perseverance, and a lot of strategic thinking and tactical maneuvering. It doesn't mean, it doesn't happen because I go outside and hold a sign. I mean, there's a lot of complex activity that goes into it. So,
Yep.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you pointed out, Doris, the symbolism, and not just the symbolism, the fact of Joe Biden standing in front of two women who are second and third in line. It's a major accomplishment.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that, is there anything we missed, Doris, that you think we should?
Let's mention our book for Congressional Quarterly Press, Women in American Politics, 2-volume work.
The state by state book, yeah.
Well, the state by state 4 volumes, but the 2-volume work we did for Congressional Quarterly Press.
Okay.
And, I'll let me lean over here and get it. This one, the Women in American Politics. Am I holding that up?
No, you got it right.
Okay. That has chapters on women as governors, women as mayors, women in state legislatures, women in the judiciary. And then the second volume has state by state brief histories of the suffrage movement and list of women who have been elected up until 2010 when it was published. So it's a very useful tool.
Yeah. And also I do want to mention, because this is a WNBA event, that Doris also helped us work on. Was one of the major writers for Women in the Literary Landscape, a centennial publication of the Women's National Book Association. And in that, Doris and Roz Reisner, with some help from me and Nancy Rubin Stewart, helped to chronicle how women had kind of had a singular role in the development of the book world, literary landscape since the founding of the country, or even before then. And that is a great addition to your women's history bookshelf.
Just one little factoid from that. At the same time that Charles Dickens was publishing David Copperfield, a woman whose name I can't recall right now, lived in New York, lived on an island in the Hudson River. She wrote a book with a female protagonist that outsold David Copperfield in England. Nobody knows that sort of thing.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of, as the book describes, there were a lot of women who led the various literary movements, a lot of women who were booksellers, which is how the WNBA was found in 1917. It's
directly related to the parades for the right to vote.
Yes, right. So all of this is related in a very interesting way. Julie, do you think it's time for us to take questions? It is about almost 20, it's a little after 20 of.
Yes. Let's see what we have here. So Antoinette said, I am interested in learning more about the struggle in West Virginia. I am from there and it was never mentioned in West Virginia history class.
It could make a movie. Read the book and you'll find out about it. Basically what happened was that it came down to a tie, just like Tennessee. And there was a senator named Block who had gone to California after the thought that everything was settled. And he got a telegram when he was in Chicago saying, turn around, come back. So he raced to get back. And meanwhile, another guy who had resigned from the legislature and moved away came back and said, I'm still a member of the legislature. So huge fight, lots of interesting ambitions. You mainly have to credit men for it. I can't think of a single woman in West Virginia who turned handsprings for it. But I'm glad you brought it up because there's a stereotype that all of the South opposed. Most of the South did, but still there were northern states that did not ratify. Connecticut never ratified.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Surprising.
So
maybe they'll get around to it soon.
Yeah, it depends on who's in office. And in Connecticut, it was a governor who simply refused to call a session.
Oh, wow. Huh. Amazing.
Dawn asked, were Western states more liberal because women were more needed to settle it? What about women who dress as men to accomplish tasks like Charlie Pankhurst in California, the first woman to vote?
Yeah. Yes, the initial thing was very much men trying to get women to move there in Wyoming. Same thing happened in Alaska. The very first piece of legislation in the Alaska Territory when they first formed the legislature was to give the women equal civil rights, and including the vote. So there was that aspect. And then you mentioned California. California women were so smart and so sophisticated. They used techniques that were brand new, including electric billboards, ads in movie theaters, which were brand new at the time. And they lost their first big campaign. And they knew that the ballot boxes in San Francisco had been manipulated by the liquor industry there, the vice industry. And So they ran the second campaign, and this time they hired Pinkerton guards to guard the ballot boxes in San Francisco, and they won. And again, it surprises people because San Francisco is now so liberal, but at that time, the rural areas, the men in the rural areas were the ones who pushed it over.
Before we go on to the next question, I'm wondering if you want to discuss a little more about the linkage between suffrage and temperance.
Okay, yeah, huge problem, huge problem. When the movement began, women had no legal rights, married women. Once you married, you did not exist legally. So a man could mortgage the family farm. He could will his children to somebody other than the mother if he died.
Wow.
Women could not sue for divorce. If they did, they, of course, would lose their children. So a man could drink with impunity and gamble with impunity, and wasn't anything his wife could do about it. So the temperance movement was very closely tied to the suffrage movement, the movement for women's rights. A lot of women were active in both. Susan B. Anthony was active in temperance before she was active in suffrage.
Right.
And but by the time we get around to Carrie Chapman Catt, 60, 70 years later,
And when was that, Doris? Roughly?
Oh,
Carrie.
Catt became president in 06, and then she had to drop out for a while because her husband died, and came back in 15. But we're talking,
yeah,
a while. And the leaders later on were more sophisticated. Catt had traveled. They drank wine at French dinners, you know, that sort of thing. They were not hung up on temperance. But the stereotype was so strong,
yeah,
that it really hurt them. And the important thing here is that the 18th Amendment was the Prohibition Amendment. It banned alcohol throughout the United States and was passed during World War I before the 19th Amendment. So the lobbyists who kept after the women, it was just a failure to accept reality, much like some people fail to accept reality today. Women were not responsible for prohibition, and it was adopted before the vote was adopted. By hypocrites, by hypocrites, and repealed as soon as we elected, another Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt.
Following up on that, Dawn said, I heard the temperance union assumed drunkenness was a lower class problem. Also read the legal status of women. If widows in the 1600s regained some rights to property, putting survival needs aside, why would women seek to marry again if they had a choice?
Yeah, most of them didn't have any choice. Their families insisted on it. There were some women who stayed single deliberately, who thought through these legal rights. A woman in New Hampshire, Marilla Ricker, a leader in the movement, and she stayed single so that she could run her own property. The Clay sisters in Kentucky, descendants of what's his name, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, they stayed single deliberately. Susan B. Anthony stayed single deliberately. And here's a good story. In 1876, when the nation was getting ready to celebrate 1776, the women wanted to rent a facility in the Centennial Hall in Philadelphia, big celebration in Philadelphia. 10 million people came. So they wanted to rent a place and could not. They had to wait for Susan B. to arrive because all the other women were married, and a married woman couldn't sign a rental contract.
oh, wow.
I'm not sure if that answered the question, but more information.
Sheila says, thank you, Doris. This is fascinating. Any thoughts on the current Supreme Court confirmation hearings and the condescending and racist tone of certain men, Grilly, Ketanji Brown Jackson? Seems we have a ways to go.
I think they'll confirm her. I think they know the nation would be so outraged. Her qualifications are just infinitely better than any number of men who have sat on the court. And I don't see them being that politically dumb. It'll come back to haunt them in the fall if they do.
Dawn asked, to what extent were mental hospitals used against suffragettes? I know of one case, but I also that in the 1920s, mental hospitals were still used to silence troublesome women.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. This is another really good case study. A Massachusetts state senator had his wife convicted and sent to a mental hospital, probably because he was abusing their daughter. She somehow got in touch with Susan B. Anthony and other radicals who sprung her from the hospital. And she hid with a Quaker family, the victim of the senator's wife. And again, conflict in the national movement. The guys, William Lloyd Garrison, all the great Frederick Douglass, all the great male abolitionists said, you can't do this, you're breaking the law. You've got to return her to the senator. And she refused. But they could see in that case that the law should be obeyed. But at the same time, they were disobeying the fugitive slave law and encouraging everybody else to. It just, they didn't see women's civil rights as equivalent to racial civil rights. And yeah, mental hospitals were used and abused for a long time. Abraham Lincoln's son, Todd Lincoln, put Mary Lincoln in an asylum. And another interesting story.
That's really interesting. The next question is, not only are you a historian, but you're also a women's advocate. Can you tell us about some of your favorite projects?
Writing. I write a weekly column for a newspaper, La Gaceta, which is the nation's only trilingual newspaper with pages in Spanish, English, and Italian.
Wow.
And we're coming up on our centennial next month. Doesn't have a wide circulation, but political people in Florida pay attention to it. But writing is my favorite activism and always has been. I speak as a result of the books, and I used to lobby. I lobbied for a women's political caucus. I was an early member of NOW. I'm not doing those things anymore because I'm just too old and it's just too discouraging. But I'm still belong to the League of Women Voters and I'm active in it. And
tell us about the statue.
The Mary McLeod Bethune statue.
Yes.
Yeah. I have all these little projects that I kind of forget about. Every state is entitled to 2 statues in the national capital. And Florida has had one for the last Confederate general to surrender. It was placed there in 1922 during a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow. And one of my dear friends, I've known her since she was 6 years old, Kathy Castor, is a member of Congress now. And when the movement started to take down Confederate statues. She worked to get that removed, and he's now sitting in the basement of the Capitol facing the wall. But it took several years to get a replacement settled. We did some polls, we lobbied the legislature, and in July, that Confederate general will be replaced by Mary McLeod Bethune, and it will be the first African American woman honored by a state in the nation's capital. So I'm looking forward to going up to DC for that.
Not
Can
only
you-
congratulations on that, but thank you for that.
No, you're
Thank you for your work.
Can you tell us a little bit about Mary McLeod Bethune? 2 sentences. Can you tell us a little bit about Mary McLeod Bethune?
Oh, yeah. She was incredible. People think of her as just the founder of Bethune-Cookman College here in Florida, which is known for its football team and band. But she, in her lifetime, she was frequently voted one of the most influential women in the world. She established that college. She went on to be appointed by President Roosevelt as the first Black of either gender to head a federal agency, the National Youth Administration. She was a major factor in the Women's Army Corps in World War II. She was a leader in Planned Parenthood, and President Truman appointed her as the only woman of color in the entire world at the founding meeting of the United Nations.
Thank you.
Quite
Interesting.
impressive. Next question is, what drew you to women's history as a field of study?
I'm sorry, what?
What drew you to women's history as a field of study?
Oh, okay. I've got 2 stories here that I hope won't take too long, but my husband got his PhD from Harvard, and I was teaching high school, which was not unusual. This was 1968, and I had dropped out of graduate school for us to get married and buy a house. And but I could get a raise at my high school if I took one more graduate level course. And I enrolled in a course on immigration at Harvard Summer School. So you know the guy who teaches it is going to be a world expert. And one day he said that men adjusted to America faster than women, that women were more likely to get homesick, want to go back to Europe, didn't learn the language, etc. So I raised my hand in politics and said, what about women like my Norwegian and German grandmothers who got jobs in American homes? Wouldn't they learn from the inside what Americans ate, what they wore, how they lived? Wouldn't they learn the language with a far better vocabulary than, say, a Slavic man who's working in steel mill? I'm sorry, Slavic man working the steel mills with other Slavs. And he looked at me like the thought had never crossed his mind. So I went over to Widener Library, which is the second largest library in the world, next to the Library of Congress, to check out a simple book on immigrant women. And there wasn't one. There were books on immigrants, there were books on women. And so I spent the next almost 15 years reading books on immigrants and reading books on women, and combining them into foreign and female, which you can see back there, along with my bed. I'm in the guest bedroom because we won't talk about it. My second book was American Women in World War II, and that grew out of a direct experience also. I went to one of the first meetings of NOW in the Boston area, and a whack and a wave got into an argument about which was a better military organization for women during World War II. And another woman had worked in the shipyards around Boston and told us about how they had 24-hour childcare and take-home meals to attract women to work in the shipyards.
Wow.
So all of this was news to me and to the younger women. So that was the topic of my second book, and that's how I got into it.
Fascinating.
Totally. Did you ever imagine taking one course would change the course of your
Yes, yeah, it
career?
changed my life. It did.
Yeah.
It did. Mhm.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Victory for the Vote focuses on the culture and community surrounding the suffrage movement rather than on any one specific person, which makes it a bit unusual. How did you choose to structure the book to be so expansive rather than a narrow focus?
Because no one does anything alone. And it was a big movement and there are a lot of people in it. I guess probably coming from a reference background, my third and fourth books were referencey type things. I did 400 biographies for Prentice Hall, and then I did a chronology of American women, starting with the fact that Christopher Columbus got maps from his mother-in-law and going forward. So and even foreign and female in World War II, they're comprehensive. I'd always wanted to do a biography because it'd be easy, but but I never have.
I want to take a moment here to say that Doris once called herself to me, half jokingly, I think, the great mentioner. And the idea being that it's really important from a historiography point of view to get those names down in the historical record somehow.
And then you can follow them up with the biographies that are out there.
Yeah, because the suffrage movement or women's history in general, there are so many women who are forgotten to history. So get those names in print.
Yep.
Love that.
Once in a while, something comes out that I learned from in a biography. I really enjoyed a biography recently of Martha Coffin Wright, who was the sister of Lucretia Mott. I'm sorry, Lucretia Coffin Mott. That Coffin was their maiden name, and somebody recently published her letters, and I really enjoyed that. But in general, I don't like to read secondary works. I like to get back there to the primary works. I like to read the letters, the diaries, the firsthand stuff, not something that's been filtered through. Mm-hmm. And especially not something that already has a bias or a thesis.
That actually is a good segue into some of these next questions. How do you know when it is time to stop the research process and start writing? Or do you continuously research as you write? Valerie tells me.
There's a deadline coming up. Do you want to check or not? With my first books, I over-researched and overwrote, and I had to learn to stop and cut it down. And editors helped me do that.
Yeah.
You could research forever on anything, and I love doing that, but you need a contract, you need a deadline.
Dawn wants to know, how do you process, code, or keep track of sources, quotes, etc., while researching to have the right quote or setting at your fingertips?
I checked my earlier books. I'm sorry. You know, it's important to remember that I started in the quill and pen age, and I had boxes of the shape of recipe boxes where I put notes on a certain topic, and then when I got ready to write, I wrote up those notes. I have had word processing since the foreign and female, and this is an extractive story for people who care about the making of books. That was 1986 when it was published, and I was also working for a dear friend, the mother of my friend who is in Congress, who at that point was running to be the first woman on the Florida cabinet education commissioner. So I was very, very busy, and I thought that I was done with Foreign and Female and had sent it off, and I thought we were in production. And I guess, you know, one of the problems with publication is that you rarely have the same editor throughout. Valerie saved me for that, but with the earlier books, 3 and 4 editors per book, so you're starting over all the time. Anyway, I was in the midst of this very busy campaign, and she sent an email. No, it must have been a phone call. We didn't have email yet. And said, I've been looking at this, and we can keep our production schedule if you'll cut out the chapter on employment, or cut out the section on employment with Immigrant Women. And I said, we'd be left with the bedroom and the kitchen. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
So my husband, bless his heart, had just bought a word processor, and he spent, well, she said, if you can do this, revise it in 2 weeks, we can keep on the production schedule. So bless his heart, he typed in the entire manuscript, printed it out for me. I'd go through with pencil, knocking stuff out,
Very good.
rewriting it, and we got it done in the 2 weeks.
Wow.
I want to do a sing out to my husband who died 2 years ago. I never could have done this without his support. Never,
Yeah.
never.
Great guy. Also, Doris, I wanted to mention Hillary Poole, who also was a major editor who worked at with your first books before my company, but she was probably the editor on nearly all of the books that you did,
Yes.
except maybe for the last 2
Yes.
when I worked on them.
Yes. Yeah. And she was very good about reminding me about deadlines. Yeah, Hillary was excellent. Excellent. Best
Great.
editor
Great.
I've ever had.
Yeah,
You know,
she's-
excluding you, of course, but she was excellent.
I'm so glad that you've had such good experiences.
Mhm.
We have a few more questions. What was, how long did it take you to write the book? And that's a 2-part question, because how long did you work on it the first time around? And then how long did it take you to revise it?
It was the fastest book I've ever done, because we wanted it for the 1998 150th celebration of the 1848 Centennial Seneca Falls Convention. And I was working with Hillary on Milestones, which was published in 1997. And then this idea came up for 1998. So I had to work fast. And again, Hillary was wonderful. Valerie did a great job of choosing the pictures. And so that was very fast. And the revision of it, we spent more time,
Yeah.
but that was probably partly because of COVID, partly because my husband was dying, partly because
Well, it was a challenge to get it into a concise enough shape to make it a manageable publication. Because this part we added, part 2, which is from 1920 to current day, there was much to write about, obviously.
Yep.
And so we kind of went back and forth a little bit on how to structure that and what to focus on.
Yeah, and once again, I want to do a shout out to you, Valerie, because you chose the pictures, you do the design, and that just allows me to think about the narrative, and it makes all the difference.
Thank you.
What was the most fun part to write?
About this book,
Yeah,
I can tell you what was the most difficult.
go for it.
The ERA,
Yeah.
because when we wrote it
Yeah.
in the summer of 19, we had no idea what was going to happen. There was a movement to revive it.
Yeah,
That-
we kept revising that.
Yep, we waited until the last possible minute before it went to press on that.
Yeah.
That was the hardest thing. The most fun thing, I like the colonial women. They get so little attention, but I like Judith Sargent Murphy, who wrote an essay called On the Equality of Women in 1779, I believe. Mary Dyer, who was hanged because she preached the Quaker philosophy instead of the Puritan philosophy in Boston. These absolute heroes of free speech and free thought that are neglected.
I have two more questions and then we'll wrap this up. I just wanted to let you know some comments that have been said. Roz just said, it's so great to hear Doris talk about women's history. She reminds us of how far we've come and how far we have to go. Thanks, Doris and Valerie. To which Sheila responded, yes. Roz said it well. This is so rich, it could be a PBS special. So then we have Kathy in Tampa asked, what historical situation for women do you see young women today should be looking at and be concerned about?
Their personal rights, abortion rights, reproductive rights. That is the issue for young women. I'm not going to affect me. I'm too old. But young women are in real danger of losing the most fundamental, intimate decisions of whether or not to be pregnant. And that is one thing I did a little asides on as often as I could. How many women had their careers ended or changed because of an unexpected pregnancy? It's there between the lines. You can't see it. Mary McLeod Bethune was one. When she left her husband and took her 5-year-old son, I'm sure she hadn't intended for that son to be born. But over and over again, if you look between the lines, if you look at the birth dates, you can see that women had this huge personal burden thrown at them for the rest of their lives, while a man just gets up and walks away from the bed. I'm sorry, but that's for young women. That is the issue now.
All right. Our last question is there anything you are working on now?
Not really. Not really. I have 2 books that Valerie knows about that I'm not working on, but 2 books that I researched and never published. One is Women During the Civil War. And again, it would be not biographies, but the chapters were by location. Women in the Western Front in Virginia and Louisiana, that sort of thing, using their diaries and letters. And the second book that I did completely, that was just an outline. But the second book that I did completely is called Sheer Genius, America's Female Philosophers. And because my husband was a philosopher, I hope to find a publisher for that. But this is illustrative. There was a woman named, I want to say Annie Jump Cannon, but it wasn't. I'm sorry. Oh, it escapes me. Calkins, Mary Calkins. She was president of both the American Philosophical Association and the American Psychological Association when those 2 fields were beginning to separate from each other. So her colleagues had enough esteem for her. She went on in psychology instead of philosophy, but her colleagues, her peers, had enough respect for her to elect her president of both of those major institutions. Now, William James was in the same era, in the same kind of crossover of philosophy and psychology. Everybody knows William James's name. Nobody knows Mary Falcon's name. So this book went through it by philosophical areas like epistemology, ethics, the fundamental areas of philosophy, finding women who spoke to those issues. I didn't try very hard to get it published, but it shows that there just isn't the interest that there should be.
Which is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it shows that we still have a lot to fight.
Not so much for me, but for the legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Legacy. I was writing about Emily Green Balch just yesterday when I was writing my column for La Gazzetta. She was the second woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and following Jane Addams. Again, everybody knows Jane Addams. Nobody knows her. And there are so many that if publishers just had a clue, and if they didn't follow each other in the most recent trend, I'm sorry, but it runs me nuts. Every day I get 3 or 4 emails from bookstores, publishers, who are all publishing the same thing. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but so much repetition focused on modern stuff and so little willingness to acknowledge that we have been here.
Well, I just want to thank you so much. This has been an amazing event. We've learned so much, and your ability to just tell us so many different stories is truly captivating. So thank you very much. I have put the links to the Victory for the Vote in the chat, but I will be sending out an email tomorrow that will have the links in it, as well as a recording of this event, so you can share it with everyone.
All right, and anybody who wants to send me an email on anything, my address is doris@dweatherford.com, and there it goes on the screen. So feel free. My cat is not a real good conversationalist, and there's nobody else around here, so feel free. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julie.
You're welcome. I have one more. Here we go. Sorry, my slide just disappeared. I'm gonna quickly pop up a slide that shows some of our upcoming events, because we're so glad that you came to this event. So we hope that you'll join us at future WNBA events. We will be sending out the events email for April the 1st week, so next week. So if you aren't already signed up for our emails, I encourage you to sign up. That way you get information about WNBA as well as our upcoming events. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to both of you. Oh, I have one more thing. For all of you who have attended tonight, your name is going to be entered into a giveaway raffle. And here we go. You will be entered to win a women's suffrage playing card deck. So
Good.
I'll be putting all your names in the raffle, and we'll contact the winner by email.
All right, good.
Great.
I hope I win.
So thank you again to both of you. This has been a wonderful event, and we appreciate the time you've taken. For those of you who don't know, we planned this event last year, so it's taken a few tries, but we finally made it, and it was well worth the wait. So thank you both, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Have a good night.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.